Hey everyone, this is the Love of Cinema podcast. We like to talk movies. If you like to talk movies too, you come to the right place.
The earlier Agneepath was more rough around the edges. It was more organic, right? Sanjay Dutt did a really good job in the new Agneepath, but the older Agneepath, there was something about the Danny character, there was something about Kancha Chena, which survived the ages. And then there is Amitabh Bachchan, right? Amitabh Bachchan in the 80s was this kind of sleeping giant.
Roughly half hour into Mukul Anand's 1990 action drama Agneepath, Amitabh Bachchan arrives in a black Ford Mustang at a secluded petrol pump, where his one-time mentors, and now adversaries, await to finish him off. As soon as Bachchan's Mustang arrives, there is a barrage of bullets on the car. Then, the bullets stop. The driver's side door swings open, and Bachchan steps out of the car, dressed in a white suit, white shirt, and white shoes. A key scene from the film follows. The entire sequence looks grand and feels unlike anything you'd see in a Hindi film of the time. It feels like a scene out of 70s or 80s Hollywood action films, like one of the better films of John Sturges or De Palma or Don Siegel. Mukul Anand was a director well ahead of his times. He was someone with cinematic finesse and style to burn, and wasn't afraid to dabble in the 70s and the 80s American aesthetic on the canvas of mainstream Hindi cinema. This is Himanshu, and you're listening to the Love of Cinema podcast. Before moving on, a quick announcement. Now, you can support the Love of Cinema podcast on a monthly basis. If you enjoy organic conversations centered on Indian cinema, Love of Cinema podcast was created for people just like you. So if you find value in the podcast, if it helps you in discovering new films or new facets about familiar films, please do consider supporting the show. Love of Cinema podcast is my passion project. And with every episode, I have attempted to create something that cinephiles will continue to find value, not just today, but over time as well. To create something that goes beyond banter, beyond trending films. So if you find value in the conversations on the podcast, do consider supporting the show. Your support will help me continue to create content with shelf life for fans of Indian cinema like you everywhere. You will find the link to support the show in the episode notes of every episode. You can also support the show directly from the podcast website. It's fast and easy to support the show, and more importantly, your support is greatly appreciated. Also, independent podcasts like this one don't have a platform for amplification and distribution. Independent pods rely on amplification through its listeners. So if you like the episode, please share the episode on social media. Also, do take a minute to review and rate the podcast. That would be much appreciated and would help the pod. Back to today's episode. Mukul Anand left his way too early, but he left behind cinema for generations to discover. Cinema that married style with thoughtful, entertaining storytelling. I'm delighted to welcome on the podcast National Film Award-winning author and biographer Amborish Roychoudhury to talk more about Mukul Anand and Agneepath, a film that deserves more respect, a film that offers much more beyond the iconic lines and the iconic Bachchan moments, and a film that we both believe would have been Mukul Anand's pick if he had been pressed to pick his favorite. Amborish has written a chapter on Agneepath in his lovely book titled In a Cult of Their Own, for which he won a special mention at the 2019 National Film Awards. I'll include the Amazon link for his book in the episode notes. Do check it out. By the way, Amborish is currently working on an authorized biography of the great Raj Khosla. Amborish and I chatted about Mukul Anand's brilliance, the layered writing of Agneepath, Bachchan's experimental turn as Vijay Dinanath Chauhan, and much more. This episode is somewhere a tiny effort to bring forth the merits of a film that was Mukul Anand's labor of love, and look back on a Bachchan performance that came at an interesting juncture in the actor's career, marked the beginning of his popular collab with Mukul Anand, and remains an important milestone in the actor's journey. Mukul Anand, Bachchan, Mandwa, here goes. Hey Amborish, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Himanshu. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot, first of all, for coming on the podcast today to talk about Agneepath and Mukul Anand, film that I like very much. I know you tossed up a lot of titles when I asked you, to come on the podcast and the films that you would like to talk about. So they were all great names. And, I know you're also writing a book on Raj Khosla right now. So you also, suggested a couple of Khosla titles. But, when you said Mukul Anand, I kind of just, grabbed it because Mukul Anand films are real dear to me. Maybe, because I grew up on those films. So, and I'm a big Bachchan fan. So, like all of us, I guess. So, I said, okay, let's go with Agneepath. So to start with, Amborish, I just wanted to talk about Mukul Anand a little bit. And, for you and I who have grown up on these films and like Hum and Khudagawa, we are well aware of it. But there are a lot of young listeners to the podcast. And so I just wanted to set this up for them as to who Mukul Anand was, because maybe not all of them are familiar with his films. And then if you could add more to it, add some more color to it. So that would be nice.
Sure.
Mukul Anand was a visionary. He dreamed big, had a style, and he had a lot of technical finesse as well to burn. Early in his career, he made a couple of remakes of classic thrillers. I think he remade Dial M for Murder as Agneepath, and he made the old Cape Fear as Kanun Kya Karega. And by the way, this was way before Scorsese remade it.
Yes.
So those were two films that he did. Check those two films out too if you haven't discovered Mukul Anand yet, or you haven't seen his films, because even in those early films you'll see a lot of style, and you will be acquainted with the white compositions that he kind of made his signature style. And of course he went on to make 3 films with Bachchan in the 90s, 3 very unique films. One of them is Agneepath, and that's the film that we're going to talk about today. But those 3 films, the way I look at them is that those 3 films nicely bookended Bachchan 1.0, if you will, the pre-mid 90s Bachchan. So that's why those 3 films are special as well. And each film, I think, holds up well, even today for the most part. He passed away way too young. Amborish, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was only 45 when he passed on. But he left behind cinema, which continues to be discovered by every generation since. What can you add to this about Mukul Anand, Amborish?
First of all, thanks for bringing me in, inviting me here. I'm glad. Speaking of Mukul Anand, I think as you rightly pointed out, it's kind of difficult to introduce Mukul Anand to a newer generation. I mean, you have to see his films and be a part of that history to actually know the kind of significance he had, or the kind of impact he had at that point of time. Because if you look at the history of cinema, probably if you're looking at the 70s and 80s films, there's a possibility you might not look at Mukul Anand in totality, because in terms of his cinema, the really successful or iconic ones are the ones that we call as the Bachchan trilogy. And they came right one after the other. I mean, there's Agneepath, Hum, and Khudagawa. But I think Mukul Anand was a visionary. He had a very distinct and unique style. He dabbled with Gujarati cinema initially. He ghost directed a bunch of films. He was in advertising. I think he did this Coke campaign / video, which became very popular. in the late 80s, early 90s in Doordarshan. And so he, after all of that, he did that remake, Kanun Kya Karega, which is a remake of the earlier Cape Fear. And interestingly, when that film, the critic Rauf Ahmed, who was the editor of Filmfare at one point, so Rauf Ahmed had written about this. He had seen the film and he was really impressed by the style and by the cinematography and by the general approach to storytelling. He really loved the film, but he had not seen Cape Fear. He really loved the film, and Mukul Anand was just outside the theater, standing, greeting everyone who was stepping outside after having watched the film. Rauf Ahmed met him and complimented him on the direction. He was a new director. They had not met earlier and all of that. And when Rauf Ahmed told him that, it's such a great film that you have made, he said, "Oh, so you like the Hindi Cape Fear?" Is what Mukul Anand said. He could have, he could have easily, took the compliment and moved on. So there you go. He didn't make, a lot of hoopla on the fact that he was basically remaking a lot of these Hollywood hits, unofficial remakes, I mean, practically copying, but he was doing that, and he was unabashedly doing that, bringing in his own elements. So I think, yeah, Mukul Anand is a very, very important filmmaker. One last note is the note at which his life ended, which was thus a film that he had planned with Sanjay Dutt and Salman Khan at a really big scale. And some reporters were there. They had taken some pictures. Those pictures were all across the very, very, very early internet,
Right.
and they were also in the newspaper. So everybody is waiting for that film. It was about an episode in the history of Kashmir, and they kind of built sets somewhere in Utah, in the US, I think, because he didn't get the permission in Kashmir. So it was to be a very grand spectacle. They shot parts of it, but then he passed away, unfortunately, without completing the film. But the shots of the film still remain. Some of them are on YouTube. One could take a look at that, just to look at that would tell you what kind of, or what stature of filmmaker Mukul Anand was. They're really very stylish, and that song, which they incorporated certain shots from the film and made a music video out of it. Um, सुनो गौर से दुनिया वालों, बुरी नजर ना हम पे डालो. That song was a huge hit. Shankar Ehsaan Loy, I think it would have been their first music direction or first film.
Right.
Uh, Not entirely sure about that, but I think it would have been if the film would have released on time. But it's a but that video still exists. So yeah, so he couldn't complete that film. It would have been a grand spectacle. Yeah,
Yes, I remember because I think that the soundtrack was released. So I
yeah.
think the all of the songs were out. And like you said, yeah, I think it would have been the first probably soundtrack by Shankar Ehsaan Loy. It's some beautiful songs, by the way. Today, when we were talking about Mukul Anand before, when I contacted you, why did you choose Agneepath? Agneepath is a film that, has a very had a very polarizing audience reaction to it when it released. Even
Mhm.
today, I mean, it has a cult following, but some people just don't buy into Agnipath. I mean, they are fan, even Bachchan fans. Like I know a lot of vintage Bachchan fans who are not big fans of Agnipath. But you chose Agnipath. I'm sure you have your reasons. So if you could share those reasons before we start actually talking about the film,
Mhm.
and if you could tell us why from those three Bachchan films that Mukul Anand did with Bachchan, you chose Agnipath.
Agnipath, I think, is one film that still doesn't get its due. Just because it didn't work, there was a certain and if you look at it today, it seems a little loud, right? So people look at it a certain way. They don't go deeper than that. But if you look at that film, it has not only developed a cult following over the years. I mean, if you look at, before this 2011 Agnipath came along, before that, this Agnipath had a sort of cult status. Anybody who grew up in the 80s and 90s grew up with those dialogues, right? About of Vijay Dinanath Chauhan and all of these characters. I mean, Gaitonde is like one of those commissioner names that you always remember. So these characters, these faces, these moments were imprinted in our minds when we grew up. So when I saw the latter Agnipath in 2011, I really liked the overall execution of the film, the way the film has been packaged, some performances, so on and so forth. But to me, it was just too well done or well packaged, if you get my drift. But then the earlier Agnipath was more rough around the edges. It was more organic, right? Sanjay Dutt did a really good job in the new Agnipath, but the older Agnipath, there was something about the Danny character, there was something about Kancha Chena, which survived the ages. And then there is Amitabh Bachchan, right? Amitabh Bachchan in the 80s was this kind of sleeping giant, right? He had done what he did throughout the 70s. He was on a rampage through the box office. We know all of that. 80s were kind of slowing him down, right? So there were back to back, there were these two, three films, ironically, directed by two of his most famous collaborators. I mean, Prakash Mehra, and there was one Prakash Mehra film which was Jadugar, which flopped. And then there were two Manmohan Desai films. One was Ganga Jamuna Saraswati, and the other was produced by Manmohan Desai, directed by his son Ketan Desai, which is Tufan. All three of these films didn't perform as well as expected. Bachchan was still delivering the openings, mind you, right?
Right.
He was still delivering the openings, but these films are not doing as well as expected. Now, the fun thing is, when you say as well as expected, a lot of these films today would be considered hits, right? Karan Johar, interestingly, said this in the latest roundtable with Bharadwaj Rangan. In one of the interviews, he mentioned that the older Agnipath still had more footfalls
Right.
than the newer,
I
right?
heard that. Right.
And and instead of that, in spite of that, the newer one is considered a hit, and the older one is considered a flop. So there is a question of uh, too much investment, a very high budget. They had cast Mithun, they had cast Amitabh Bachchan at that time. Mithun had built a huge fan following, and he was, I mean, the 90s uh, trashy era, if I can call it that, hadn't started yet. So Mithun was still a very mainstream dancing action hero, and he was doing really good for himself. So at that time, to cast Amitabh and Mithun was quite a thing. So they ended up investing quite a lot, and the film didn't recover. But the kind of footfalls that it got, obviously, I mean, considering what Karan is talking about today, it did decently, but it didn't do as well as they had thought it would. So it faltered, it flopped, or whatever. But I remember growing up at that point of time, the kind of buzz that it created, that Agnipath created, there was a lot of expectations. The VHS cassettes did really well, considering the fact that when you got there to the libraries, you wouldn't get Agnipath half the time. So there was a lot of demand. Those dialogues had been etched in public memory really fast. I mean, they were doing the rounds. We were aping those dialogues, all of that. And the casting coup of Amitabh and Mithun was the talk of the town. In Calcutta, and this I mentioned this in my book, there were street fights in Calcutta between Mithun fan clubs and Amitabh Bachchan fan clubs. People were at each other's throats on, who upstaged who, right? But if you've seen the film, I mean, whatever. I mean, we know what eventually happened. But I think I'm not sure whether I've answered your question, but that was an attempt at saying how important Agnipath was for this generation. So when I
Right.
look at the other two films that Mukul Anand did, which is Khuda Gawa and Hum, they still get a lot of love. Agnipath somehow, maybe because of the later Agnipath and how slickly it was made, sometimes it doesn't get the kind of love that it deserves. I think it was way more well made, well written, well directed and acted than it's
Absolutely.
given credit for.
Absolutely. I completely
You
agree
know,
with you. Yeah.
people tend to club it with the trashy 90s space, and they dismiss a lot of the things in Agnipath. Now, as we will discuss, will probably hopefully discover all of these elements. I think it was a very well made and a very stylish film.
Absolutely. And one of my, small, tiny efforts with this episode is to help
Mm.
those the new generation or people who haven't seen Agnipath, or for whom essentially, Vijay Dinanath Chauhan is a meme, for them to really discover and to kind of appreciate the efforts. So, Amrish, I just wanted to, talk about the film in a nutshell before we kind of dive into the film. Agnipath is a very interesting film for a number of reasons. Like you said, I think it's a very unique kind of a Bachchan film for that era. Title of the film comes from a poem by Bachchan's father, Harivansh Rai Bachchan. The film essentially is about a young boy, Vijay, who is life hardened very early on in his life when his idealistic father, a school teacher, is kind of framed and murdered by the brothel runner of the village. Vijay grows up to be a criminal himself as he learns early on that the only thing that the world respects is power. All his life, Vijay struggles with a very difficult relationship with his mother, who is at odds at his criminal and strong arm ways. Like some of Mukul Anand's early films, Agnipath too draws a lot from widely popular films. It draws from V. Shantaram's Pinjra. It draws from both the Scarface films and even The Godfather. But mind you, it's all done rather nicely. It's derivative, yes, but people don't appreciate enough the smart, and somewhat knife-like writing of Agnipath by Santosh Saroja and Kader Khan. I must have watched the film at least a dozen times. Every time I keep hearing new beats, so to speak. So I just think that the writing of the film deserves a lot more. Now, that's Agnipath in a nutshell. Amrish, shall we dive right into the film and then start just talking about some of our favorite scenes? I think that might be the way to go. Really talking about the film.
Sure.
So
Let's do that.
I'll let you do the honors. Just pick a scene that you absolutely love, and if you could talk about that scene and the writing of the scene.
Yeah. So basically, when it comes to Agnipath, there are so many choices. There are so many scenes that one could talk about. So, for instance, the very introduction scene, the very scene when Amitabh kind of appears, there is Master Manjunath, and the perspective shifts, and suddenly there's Amitabh Bachchan on the screen, coal-lined eyes, and introducing himself as Vijay Dinanath Chauhan. And that scene was very interestingly written. It not only spells out how he looked at himself, he talks about his father and his mother, introducing them, as well as talking about his village and speaking of his age, in that one line of dialogue. Kadir Khan at that point of time was already established as a writer, as a dialogue writer. He is behind, he's not given that much of credit, but he's behind a lot of Amitabh Bachchan blockbusters, right from Satya Pe Satta to many other hit Amitabh Bachchan spectacles. Santosh Saroj is one of the names in the footnotes of film history. He's not spoken about that much. I personally don't know a lot about him, practically nothing, right? But he wrote a number of films with Mukul Anand. One of them is Agnipath, and I think it was stellar writing. In this particular scene, Gaitonde is trying to explain to Amitabh Bachchan the error of his ways. And Amitabh Bachchan very menacingly tells him that, are you telling me that I'm going to die? I know when they're going to kill me. And he shows that diary on which, interestingly, there's no other entry, but it's written in Hindi, Maut Aaj 6 baje,
6
or
बजे.
something like that. It's written in Devanagari, and there's nothing else on that page, right? And so he shows that off, and there's this discussion, and there also interestingly a little sliver of Godfather comes in that conversation, where he says, where Gaitonde is talking to him, and he basically says that Vijay Dinanath Chauhan is going rogue, and he's saying no to his mentors, these trio of gangsters who have basically raised him, and he's telling them no. And one of the businesses that he's telling them no for is the business of drugs, because he doesn't like drugs, which again harks back to
Definitely, yes.
uh, yeah, Vito Corleone and that epic conversation. So that was one part. The other thing for trivia mongers, something that I took a lot of pleasure while writing the book was also, playing around with that timeline of his age, where he, basically says, 36 36
36
साल
साल 9 महीने
9 महीने 8 दिन
8 दिन.
और ये 16 घंटा चालू है. 16 घंटा चालू है. So, just taking the release date of Agneepath, I, kind of back calculated and arrived at a birth date for Vijay Dinanath Chauhan, which was in the 50s. Now, I mean, these are frivolous things, but we all geek out with Star Wars. We geek out with, The Godfather and stuff like that. And we don't do that level of we don't get into that nerd side of Bollywood so much. But here, if you go back and you do the math, you realize that he was born somewhere in the 50s. So he came to Bombay somewhere around 1964-65. Now, if you look at the way the scenes have been built, the initial scenes, Tereline and these gangsters, hiring this goon to kill Kanchachina, there's this initial build-up scene where Master Manjunath is kind of polishing the shoes, and in that scene, he builds the vibe of the 60s, right? You can see 60s Bombay in that small corner. It's not like he built some elaborate sets, but Mukul Anand managed to show a side of the 60s. You can look at the trousers, the shirts,
The
the
cars.
way the cars, the mustache, the walking stick that he walks around with. All of that spells 60s, right? He doesn't scream and point to it, but you know it in your gut when you're watching the film, right? So that effort is visible. So that also, in a very weird, geeky sort of way, connects back to that dialogue and that conversation, right? Where he talks about his age, and you kind of, think about it, how old he's in the 1990 and going back. So that was, I think, a great, um, not only a great conversation scene. We don't have a lot of those in Bollywood. It's all action, action, action. But that was a great conversation scene. It puts the character of Vijay Dinanath in perspective. It also puts their relationship in perspective. His relationship with Gaitonde, which has a sort of a how do I put it? A very bromance feel to it,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
If
It's
I may
almost
put
like
it that
a elder brother who
Yeah,
also happens to be somewhat of a father figure, but not really.
yeah,
But it's more like an
yeah,
elder brother, like you said.
yeah. So in the 70s, I mean, he could have been a Pran or somebody who is kind of a parallel protagonist role, right? But here, his role was slightly underwritten. But if you look at the script in its totality, Gaitonde is a huge figure in the Vijay Dinanath Chauhan myth, right? So that is also put in context in that scene. So I think it was beautifully done. And then if we start from there, there's a plethora of scenes. There's that scene where uh, he meets them, the three the three of Terilene and Hasmukh Bhai, and I'm forgetting Avatar Gill's character. He
Usman.
meets them, Usman Bhai, right? He meets them in their den, and they're kind of scheming about him and talking about killing him. And then he walks in, and all the phones start ringing, right? And
Terrific scene. That's
then
a
he
terrific scene.
says, yeah, and then he says, "Idhar telephone bahut bachta hai," right? And then there's a very menacing conversation. I mean, it also builds up his persona in front of these three people, because just 5 minutes prior in the film, you're seeing that these three are pretty badass people. They're, scheming, murdering, all of that kind of stuff. And they have brought this bacha, they've picked up this kid from the streets, and they're thinking, oh, he'll be grateful, all of that. And within 5 minutes, we can see that he's the tallest one in the room, literally and figuratively, which is built through this whole menacing conversation. The telephone thing, they come back to later. I think I don't remember whether it happens in this scene or later on when he says "गलत चीज बनाया telephone." आदमी बोलता कुछ है, सोचता कुछ है, right? Again, a brilliant dialogue and a brilliant
Terrific
scene.
lines. Yeah.
Yeah. In very interesting ways, both the Scarface movies have very interesting scenes with the telephone. I don't know whether Mukul Anand thought about it or it was a deliberate nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of a scene. But telephone was important in all the a phone was important in all the three scripts in their own ways. You can watch those films to kind of see that. So that was another scene. And if we talk about scenes, I mean, we can talk about them all night, because Agnipath has an endless array of scenes, which is like another scene that is really really close to my heart, and I would like to talk about is that there's a very action films have a very long tradition in Hindi cinema, right from the 70s onwards. I mean, even before that, but mostly it became a genre 70s onwards. So the hero has a very cult mythical figure. So considering that, this whole scene where the sister is kidnapped, right,
One of my favorite
by
sequences.
Shetty, yeah, Shetty, and at that moment, right, you're looking at Neelam being kidnapped, and even before Vijay Dinanath Chauhan says anything, is, oh boy, you know, something's going to happen now,
It's
right?
trouble. Yeah.
Considering how his character has been built, like this, He-Man or a sort of god, kind of a mythical figure. And it's interesting. I find it endlessly interesting that Amitabh Bachchan, considering how we look at action heroes today, or badass heroes today, he didn't have an ounce of muscle on him, right? He was this lean man, and Salim Saab constantly says that in real life, I mean, anybody could take him, right, in a heartbeat, right? But when he's on scene and he's holding that gun, yeah, I mean, he means business, right? So Amitabh Bachchan, I always find it so interesting that when you're looking at him in the screen, there's no muscle, nothing. It's just the height, and you look at that frail frame, and somehow he looks badass. He looks like he could take the world, right?
And his
So in that
voice.
scene, and that voice. There's something very interesting when it comes to the film. But if we go back to that scene, Shetty has kidnapped his sister, and then Mithun jumps at the car, hangs onto it, and they go to that slum place, and they have a confrontation. Mithun and Shetty, which is played by Deepak Shirke, phenomenal villain character, by the way. Again, doesn't get enough love. So there, Mithun and Shirke have this little moment of conversation and back and forth dialogues, and Mithun, kind of hurls a slew of abuses at him in Tamil, right? So this conversation begins in half accented Hindi and Tamil, right? So Mithun starts his conversation in Tamil and then, goes on about Mare Jaat ka naam kharab kiya, all of that, so on and so forth, right? Uh, so all of that happens, and you can see parallelly how Bachchan is literally cutting through the the slum area, and it has been established right before the scene that there are about 2,000 men that they'll have to fight even to reach it, right? So it so it still gives me goosebumps, like when I saw it first time. I mean, so that's one of the great scenes, right? If you look at the action choreography, this scene is developed parallelly, right? So Mithun is fighting them, or there's a conversation between Mithun and Dilip Shirke, and then you are parallelly you are seeing Amitabh Bachchan cutting through the crowd with his gang and reaching the den or the hideout, and obviously that after all of that build up, we get the payoff, right? We get the payoff when he meets him and starts bashing him, and then that sword scene, all of that, right? um so I think that was a very, very key Mukul Anand kind of a scene. I mean, that's what he's all about, I think. Again, going back to your first question where it spoke about Mukul Anand, which is why I'm saying it's kind of difficult to say, talk about the importance of his direction, because it was not about a particular kind of framing or a particular style of direction. He had that style and panache, that kind of Hollywood uh, kind of had in at that point of time. I mean, maybe in the 70s and 80s in action films, he kind of brought that and meshed it with a very Indian dialogue bazi sensibility in his own way. And you can see both of that at play in that scene, where it's a very top angle shot. Amitabh and his gang is literally ripping through those lanes and trying to reach there. And parallelly, there's this dialogue bazi happening, right? So he blends these two worlds very, very beautifully, which to someone who doesn't dig a little deeper, it might seem cacophonic, it might seem loud, whatever. But I'm saying, I mean, it's operatic,
It
that
is,
scene, if
yeah,
you look at it.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great word, Amrish. I completely agree with you. Even Bachchan's performance, I've always said, is like his Agneepath turn is essentially done on an operatic scale. And that's why, it might seem larger than life or over the top for many. But I think that particular character and the tone demanded that. I just wanted to touch on two things quickly. One thing you mentioned was the attention to detail. And I think that's phenomenal. Like you said, the cars are all from the 60s. The fort area, the Ballard Estate area is really used nicely. The art is by Sudhendu Roy, the great Sudhendu Roy, the legendary director and art director who did so many of Bimal Roy's classics, as well as Yash Chopra's films. There's one particular set, I remember the young Vijay, played by Master Manjunath, and he burns down that petrol pump. That petrol pump set is actually modeled after car fuel petrol pump in Fort, which is one of the oldest petrol pumps in the entire country. And I believe it's the only Art Deco petrol pump. It even exists today. It's a very small place. And if you go to Ballard Estate in Fort in Mumbai, you'll see that. And that particular set of that petrol pump was modeled after that. And so that kind of detail and, that kind of level of effort is just amazing. And I think a lot of people miss that. And one more thing I wanted to add before we move on is going back to the dynamic you said about Vijay and Gaitonde. And I think those two scenes, there are two scenes with him. The one is, of course, the iconic, introductory scene, where, like you said, the young Vijay Dinanath Chauhan is talking with Gaitonde. And then we cut to an adult Vijay, like all grown up. And then we have those iconic lines. And the scene ends with, so to speak, criminal, stamping his supremacy inside the police station, which is the cop's fortress, right, if you will. And then there is a companion scene to this particular scene later in the film when Vijay visits Gaitonde at his home in the presence of his wife and kid, Gaitonde's wife and kid. And after their confrontation, when he's walking out, Vijay overhears Gaitonde's kid ask his dad if that was Vijay Dinanath Chauhan, the goon. And that breaks him, right? What the kid thinks of him totally breaks him. And I thought that that's a fabulous companion scene to the first one because, again, Santosh Saroj and Kader Khan, they're doing so many things here, because it's like...
And he's literally paying back, paying back the favor of Gaitonde trying to warn him. And now he's back trying to warn him. But he's kind of beating about the bush, building it up with this analogy of the चूहे को बिस्तुइया खा जाता है and सांप नेवले को खा जाता है and all of that, and he's building up those analogies basically to tell him, dude,
your life's in danger.
I mean, So I think it's a beautiful scene, and like you rightly pointed out, these two are companion scenes, very, very well connected. So there you go. There's the brilliance of that script, of that screenplay, which I don't think not a lot of people look at it like that.
Amrish, another scene that I love is where Bachchan steps out of the Mustang and they fire on his car. And that's a beautiful wide composition scene. And again, going back to what you said, that Mukul Anand being influenced by a lot of the 70s and the 80s aesthetic. There is one particular moment in that scene I remember when they're just waiting inside the car, Sharat Saxena and what's his name? Rathod, I believe is the actor's name, Arvind Rathod.
Arvind Rathod.
Yes. Rathod, yeah. So they're waiting inside that car. And that scene actually is straight out of a film that Sturges did in the 70s. I think it's called MCQ. It's an action film. It was with John Wayne. It wasn't a huge success, but I think that scene is very similar to a scene from that film. And that's to say, it's not about ripping off or, copying that scene, but it's about your style of the aesthetic, where you get that from. And I think Mukul Anand gets that a lot from the 70s and the 80s action movies, American action movies.
I also personally, I personally think that scene also kind of parallels the Sonny Corleone assassination scene, the shootout scene.
Definitely.
At the toll booth. But he just played around with these elements, I think. I mean, it was not a direct, so like you were saying, it's not a rip-off. It's just things that he saw and he's having fun. Today, if he were alive, he would be having a blast. I mean, because movies are more self-aware today. People are, doing these small nudges and winks and, movie references and all of that, which was not a thing back then.
Absolutely.
So he was trying to do his own thing at the same time, pandering to the audience, trying to make a film which would succeed. So he had to do a lot of quote unquote compromises. But I think he was a man way, way ahead of his time. We didn't, he wasn't seen like that, unfortunately.
Yes, absolutely. And, I wish that Agneepath, had the kind of success that at least the kind of cult status that it has today. But, that's, it is what it is. There's another interesting scene, Amborish, that I wanted to touch on is at the very end, when Vijay is essentially, close to his death. He's lying in his mother's arms. And he talks about bringing electricity to the village, which is essentially a childhood memory, right? Because that's what his father was trying to do, before he was killed. And, that's consistent with what many believe what people do when they're near their end. They recall childhood memories, something that happened way back in the past, when they were a kid. And I just thought that, again, this is great writing, by the two, Santosh Saroj and Kader Khan, that, to incorporate that kind of a thing at the very end, just before, he's about to die. And, doing that kind of, adding that little bit of detail to the character was amazing. So, like we were saying, the writing, the style of the film, everything is deeply underappreciated. I really feel that a lot of people should revisit.
Just adding to that, the point of bringing electricity to the village. Now, look at that little detail, right? So, like I said, if you just do a simple math of, 30 years or whatever, you're looking at the 1950s. And in the 1950s, an Indian village waiting for electricity to come to it, there's a little touch of Nehruvian socialism there. There's a little touch of, kind of harks back to the films that Bimal Roy and all of those guys made. I'm not comparing the films per se. I'm just talking about how people perceived progress in a village, right? So look at all the other films that were being made in the 90s. Look at all of this thing of a villain or a bad guy coming into a sort of tranquil place and doing his thing and spreading evil and mayhem and all of that was dealt with in a very plain and simple and straightforward form in the 90s. But here there's this question of this village walking towards progress. There's this woman in the opening scenes. There's this guy who comes and says that bijli aa rahi hai gaon mein, and this engineer comes, and there's this woman who is trying to throw garbage, who throws some garbage on the streets, and his father, who is the master ji of the village, Dinanath Chauhan, he basically says, "क्या कर रही हो बहन? ये कचरा फेंकने का जगह नहीं है," and all of that. So there are a lot of elements during the build-up, which is basically talking about new India and a rural India or a village basically walking towards progress and towards everything that represented progress in a way that 1940s and 50s, how we had a lot of hope and all of that, which broke down pretty soon. But so there they have those hopes of progress, which is represented by electricity, and suddenly this guy comes, Kancha China, and he kills all hope, and so he is the antagonist in more ways than one. In terms of the screenplay, if you look at it, he's not just a guy who has snatched his dream or just destroyed the village and all of that. He is also kind of he hindered progress in that village and effectively basically killed all future for them, which again loops back to the question of electricity in the end, the last scene. So I think there also the triumph of writing and the triumph of this whole team coming together, the vision of Mukul Anand and the screenplay of Santosh Saroj really comes through, I think, in that that plug back to electricity in the end and the beginning, basically bookends in a way.
Well said. Well said. There's also this parallel, to be drawn between the relationship dynamic of Vijay and his mother, and a similar mother-son dynamic in Mother India and Vastav, where in all three films the mothers are at odds with the criminal bent of their sons, so to speak. In Agneepath, there is this constant, clash of contrasting worldviews: the worldview of Vijay and the worldview of his mother. And again, here, the writers, Kader Khan, Santosh, are so good with the screenplay and the dialogues in projecting that clash of opposing worldviews. At one point, we have Vijay talking about corruption among police. And he says, "Itne paise mein ghar nahi chalta, iman kaise chalega?" And Vijay's mom retorts that, "Aaj bhi teri maa ka ghar 500 rupees mein chalta hai, Vijay." There is another instance where, Vijay tells his mother, "Kamzori ka mail, taakat se dhulta hai maa." And Vijay's mom scoffs at Vijay's thinking and says, "Sadiya lagi insaan ko janwar banne mein, lekin tujhe zara sa bhi waqt nahi laga insaan se janwar banne mein." So again, this kind of, volley between the mother and the son, and similar kind of a dynamic in those two other films, Mother India and Vastav. I've always found that fascinating. Because again, just like father-son relationship, the mother-son relationship, and the various layers to it, it's a fascinating dynamic.
And there also in the beginning, there's this small scene where Master Manjunath is rushing into their house, and he bumps into her, and she says, "Itna bhagta kyun rehta hai? Itna jaldi bhagega to gir jayega," something on those lines, which is basically again kind of talks about how he's always kind of rushing and not thinking about things, not thinking about the direction he's walking in, right? He might fall right? These small nods in the beginning, which basically refer to the arc of the character in the very
Absolutely.
beginning, and her harping on this apne haath dhole Vijay, which you are also referring to. It's a beautiful dynamic. Um, Mother India, there's of course Vastav, and so many other films. Before Mother India, there was Aurat, which Mother India was a remake of,
Right.
where
Right.
also the mother ends up shooting the son, and yeah, so beautiful. Paying a note to that mythology, that mother-son mythology in the film.
And Bachchan's performance, Amrish, we got to talk about that when we're talking about Agnipath. So I'll give you my take on this, and then I would love to hear yours. Much more qualified take on this, and then if you could also talk about the public reaction to this particular performance when the movie came out, and then we can also talk about what it stands for today. See, I always when I was a kid when I saw Agnipath, and at that time, I kind of loved the over the top bits. But now, over the years, when I look at this particular performance in retrospect, now having watched almost all of Bachchan's filmography, I always think that Bachchan's turn in Agnipath is a lot more experimental. And I think there is a deliberate attempt at being bombastic, mostly because the character and the tone, like I said, demanded it. It's fairly obvious that he cues off to some extent from Pacino's Tony Montana in Scarface, the way he sits at the chair and all that. But like you were saying, there is a element of an operatic scale to this performance. He's modulating his voice, he's projecting an overtly, aggressive kind of a arm waving physicality, which at the time I think many read as an interesting twist to the actor's Angry Young Man act. But some found it unforgivingly, over the top and, off key. So it's an interesting, discussion. What do you think about the performance?
Yeah, I think interestingly, Amitabh Bachchan at that point of time was in a phase of his career where he was also thinking various things in terms of experimentation, uh, the direction that his career should take, if at all he should tweak his performances, which is visible in a lot of the interviews that he gave around that time. He had just done Main Azad Hoon,
Exactly. Right.
which was, yeah, which is probably the most experimental that he became at that point of time, that phase
I
of his
love that
career.
film, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lovely film. One of Tinu Anand's best, I should say. Uh, but it was not forgiven. That switch from quote unquote image wasn't forgiven. It was a different audience, it was a different India, and a different way of perceiving movies. But the fact is, if you look at the mid 80s, the big ticket blockbusters were not working. And I posted about it very recently. It's almost like deja vu when people talk about the downfall of Bollywood in the past few months, all the conversation that has been happening pre-Pathan, that Bollywood is faltering, it's no longer making the kind of films that it used to make, it's dead, and so on and so forth. It harks back to the conversation in 1985, 86, where people were saying, where Ramesh Sippy, GP Sippy actually said that I don't see my grandson in the business of movies, right? Where he's talking about Rohan Sippy, which is very much in the films today. And so that was the kind of mood at that point of time. None of the films were working. Even the great Amitabh Bachchan, the infallible Amitabh Bachchan, was unable to deliver the goods consistently. 3, 4 films, whatever. So, and these critics, the movie critics, which are very removed from how the audience was perceiving, was kind of blaming it as his monotone performances, and it's becoming monotonous, the same angry man and all of that. Now he was in his kind of nearing his 40s. He should make different kind of do different kind of roles and all of that. And Bachchan was kind of having second thought. So I think when Agnipath was being made and venturing into a director like Mukul Anand and trying a different style, was his way of experimenting with that whole angry young man myth. And one of the things he experimented with was his voice and his dialogue delivery. So there are various theories abound on who he was kind of he that raspy voice which he initially shot was, some say it was inspired from Brando in The Godfather, some say it was uh, Haji Mastan, the gangster. He spoke in a certain way. Some say it was that. But the fact is that he tried a different way of dialogue delivery, which was slightly raspy, very different from the voice that we is so iconic that and we all know him for. That's how Agnipath was initially shot. And when the film was released, it was not well received. And one of the feedbacks that they got was that the voice was a very significant factor. So he recorded again, he dubbed again in his usual voice, and they released those prints again. So the print that you see on Netflix today is the revised version with his revised voice, where he dubbed again. Uh, but on YouTube, if you look for it, you'll find the older print where it has that old raspy voice. So I think in terms of style, in terms of his acting, he was trying to do a lot of things. Um, Also the diction. Uh, the thing is, the character is a Maharashtrian character, right? So a lot of actors in the film ends up saying Chauhan, but my theory is it's actually Chavan, the Marathi uh, last name, and that's how Bachchan also says it. He doesn't say Vijay Dinanath Chauhan. He says Vijay Dinanath Chavan, right? So so it was a Maharashtrian character, and that accent was there in his dialogue delivery also. So that's there. So that way he kind of tried to experiment with his dialogue delivery, with how he approached this character. He again, there are references to Varadarajan Mudalyar, and also Marlon Brando, and of course Tony Montana, and Scarface was a huge influence, and I can see it in my mind's eye, Mukul Anand and him sitting and watching Scarface. It was like a melting pot. I mean, all of these influences coming together and then sitting there looking at that white suit and that scene from from Scarface in the restaurant where everybody is coughing at him and him, basically reflecting back at society. And they did such a brilliant. If that was a copy, I would say it's a brilliant. It's the best form of tribute that one can think of. It's a great piece of writing, that scene. I think it was very different from the people club it with the Bachchan angry young man person of the 70s, but I think it was very different. It was very, very different from that. He tried to create another myth, which, for lack of a better term, it was an angry middle-aged man or something like that. He had that very that scene where he proposes to Madhavi. Not really proposes, but in the hospital he says, मेरी माँ के बाद तूने ही पहली बार मुझे नंगा देखा है, right? And and there's this vulnerability in the character, in a grown man, right? In an adult middle-aged man, right? Who is facing a lot of crises in career and otherwise, expressing himself. So he's not really as sure of himself as probably he was in Zanjeer or Diwar, or where there was very clear conviction in his worldview. So here, despite all of that swagger, there's a little bit of vulnerability, which is there in the way he speaks to his mother. There is a worldview, there is dialogue bazi and all of that, but still there is a tinge of vulnerability there, right? So I think Amitabh Bachchan did a great job trying to tweak his persona and trying to build something new in its place. Also, the Agnipath poem, right? I'm not sure how true this is, but I've always felt that at some level, that poem was also uh, a germ of the script, right?
For sure. Yeah.
Uh, the that ideal man, and that he has to walk through all that fiery path and that journey. So at some level, it's this point is repeated throughout, but at some level I feel that that's also kind of the spring from which this story kind of developed, and Bachchan personifies it well. I mean, really, really well in that film. So I think it's a great triumph of not only writing but also performance in how he visualizes and executes that role. It's very different from anything else that he was doing at that point of time.
Would Bachchan's performance make your top 5 Bachchan performances?
Oh, that's a tough one. But I think it would. I think it
Same.
would.
Yeah.
I won't say a fixed 2 or a 3 or a 4 or whatever. It's definitely not 1. But I would say it would feature in the top 5, really because of the reasons that I have tried to explain, that he even staying within that space of a commercial angry man hero, because that is what the crowd expected from him, he tried to experiment. Now, Main Azad Hu was a radical experimentation. Here, it was even better, in my opinion, given that within that straitjacket of the commercial Hindi film hero, he tried to do something different, right? And to me, to a lot of people that I know, to a whole generation, I think, that grew up watching that film, he succeeded to a very large extent. It's still, I mean, before talking to you, I was just, obviously scrubbing through various scenes and all of that. That moment when he's sitting, lounging like that in that chair, and he says, Vijay Dinana Chauhan, it still gives you goosebumps, right?
It hits
It
hard
does
every time.
quite.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So definitely top 5, yes.
Yes. Yes. And like you said, again, to go back to what you said earlier, it's a very different kind of performance, a very different kind of film. Even the look of the film, Praveen Bhatt's beams of lights, that are constant in all the frames, and the somber palette, kind of they all give it a very uncommon, gloomy look for a quote unquote Bachchan film. And I think all of that kind of, adds to that mystique of Vijay Dinana Chauhan and Agnipath. And so I think it's a very unique film, and it stands out on its own. Like you said, along with Main Azad Hu, I think those two are definitely two of Bachchan's probably most experimental turns. He has done a lot of that later on, I think. Nishabd was also, I think, something like that. But, these two films kind of stand out because at that time he was still, very much the vintage Bachchan, of 70s, and the young angry man.
So I think that later phase is very different, and one should kind of look at it very differently. I mean, his post Mohabbat phase, which is kind of going on right now, which is, I mean, very different from his career in the 70s and 80s, and even till the early 90s, I would say. That's a very different space. So when you're talking about the top 5 performances, actually, somebody who has grown up in the 80s and 90s would practically think of that first phase for all 5, right? If you're talking about top 5, I won't probably, I mean, although arguably some of his best work he has done as a gray old man, in Piku and so many other things, but if you talk to me personally, and I'm sure it'll be with you and many other people from that generation, I mean, they would instantly, organically think of his earliest phase in terms of his best work. So I think these are two very distinct spaces when one thinks of Bachchan.
Right, right. And just a final small note is the background score of the film, which is essentially, Jean-Michel Jarre's Second Rendezvous. But, it's funny, Amrish, and I'm sure this is true, might be true with you. I don't know if it is. But, as someone back in that day, I was solely brought up on Indian music. And so, I, used to listen to very little American pop or something, So I knew Michael Jackson, Madonna, all these people, U2. But, I wasn't really that eclectic in my taste. So, like, for example, Jean-Michel Jarre. And another example is Vangelis, who's, 1492 Conquest of Paradise. For me, I learned those because that particular piece of music was used in the opening credits of Sanjay Gupta's Atish. So, that's how I discovered these pieces of music. And that's how I discovered these great artists, like Vangelis and like Jar. So it's really funny for me to look back and, now, and this was quite common that during that day. I mean, they just used to use the music at pretty much whim of at their own whim. So, but the thing is that particular piece of music works so fine for Agneepath because that I mean, every time I hear that piece of music, I don't really think Second Rendezvous. I think Agneepath. So, that's how, it's kind of mapped in my memory. But I always thought that's very interesting.
Yeah, it really, it kind of complements the film and Bachchan's character really, really well. I mean, it's become very iconic. I mean, you don't have to look at the scenes. You have to hear the music and where it's from.
Right. And what would you say about Danny and Mukul Anand had this group of actors that he worked with, especially in the three Bachchan films. So there are a lot of common, actors in all of them. And, Deepak Shirke, I believe, is also in Hum. Danny's in all three. So, but Danny's such an underrated actor. I mean, he has done this wide range of acting, and he's so underrated. But he killed it as Kancha China. I mean, he's just brilliant as Kancha China.
Yeah.
And I was reading in your book. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
So I was reading in that chapter in your book. By the way, I'll include a link to Amrish's beautiful book where he has a chapter on Agneepath, and he talks about all these anecdotes from the film and about the actors and how it all came together. So do check it out. But I was reading in that chapter that the character name Kancha China was actually suggested by Danny himself. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting, right?
So it's somewhat, I mean, not somewhat, it's altogether racist.
Yeah, exactly. So today it would be very problematic, right?
Yeah. So it's very racially loaded, that term. But, in India, the very, concept of racism is a little muddled politically and otherwise, and even from a sociological point of view. But it was Danny who suggested that name, which was a reference to how he looked and how he's referred to in the screenplay also. So it's not just the name Kancha China. At least one point in time, Terry Lean refers to him as Nepali. So when Master Manjunath, Vijay as Master Manjunath, the child, burns the petrol pump, Terry Dean, aka Sharat Saxena, comes back to the guys and informs them, or he refers to it as Nepalika manager. Bob Christo, the manager of the petrol pump, refers to him as Nepalika manager. So there's these small things. So I think the way the character was written, it was written as a person who was of a Nepali origin or from Nepal, and hence, in a very slang sort of a way, the term to refer to him was Kancha, and China was another reference to the Mongoloid looks. And that's one of the thing I think they lost the plot completely in the new film, where it's not just that name. It's again, it's racist and all of that, but it was a reference to Danny's looks. It was a reference to that, how that character was written. And I don't know whether they would have been able to do it if Danny hadn't suggested like that. I mean, I can imagine if it was written in the screenplay and they had approached him like that. Even he was a big star at that point of time. And yeah, so Danny, I think, was fascinating in that role. And in addition to being the Bachchan trilogy, it's also the Bachchan Danny trilogy. Danny resisted working with Bachchan Saab for years and years. And with Agnipath, finally, his only thing was that I'll get overshadowed. I will be overshadowed, right? Agnipath was the first script where he realized that I have a lot to chew on here, right? I will be seen and people would see me as almost a parallel kind of an antagonist who is like head to head with the hero, and which is why he signed it. And if you look at it, it's true of all the films. Khudagawa maybe a little less, because Khudagawa, A, he was not the antagonist, and B, he was a little, not, his character was slightly undercooked and underwritten. But if you look at Hum and Agnipath, his characters are menacing and massive, and how. I mean, they're really big and really
And they're
important.
still memorable. I mean, they stand out even with Bachchan in the frame. So, which is saying a
His
lot.
dialogue delivery, his diction. I mean, nobody speaks like Danny in the industry, even today. No, nobody talks like him. Nobody has that kind of dialogue delivery and command over Urdu and Hindi that Danny had at that point. And I think it really comes through in that film as well.
Right, right. And now looking back, Amborish, it's film came out in 90, so it's more than 30 years old. What do you think is Agnipath's legacy? Because it has had influence on all films. I mean, just recently, the whole thing in Son Chidiya, that Saap Khawe Chuhe Ko, Saap Khawe Gid. That I think I kind of harks back to the same, nature of the jungle law and nature's food chain that Bachchan tells Guy Tonde in Agnipath. Then, there are small nods. There was a nod in a film called Marjawa, with Siddharth Malhotra, where there is a direct nod to the scene where Vijay and Krishnan kind of help lead the funeral procession. So these small things, I mean, everybody keeps on kind of calling back to Agnipath. So definitely it's somewhere in the mind, in the psyche of all, at least people of our generation. What do you think is the larger legacy of the film?
I think when one talks about gangster movies, in Bollywood, if you look at how Hindi cinema has evolved over time, apart from the initial noir attempts by Raj Khosla and Gurudutt and people of their ilk, after that, the gangster movie we didn't have a credible gangster film till, I think, Parinda came along. And after that, close on its heels, there was Agnipath. I mean, people jump from Parinda to RGV and Shiva and all of that when they talk about gangster, and Satya, all of that. But I think Agnipath was another great template gangster movie, which paid tribute to the iconic gangster movies of the past. I mean, Scarface 1932, Scarface 1983. Of course, Godfather, the 70s. So it had all the beats, but somehow, strangely, nobody attributes or talks about Agnipath as a gangster film. I think it's an iconic gangster film, and it left its imprint in terms of legacy. And of course, like you said, there is a lot of impact on pop culture of the dialogues. Not so much the songs. Very strangely, Agnipath songs, that's one film.
Absolutely. Yeah, you said it. I mean, Mukul Anand films had great songs. And so, even, right from Ed Bar, I mean, the songs are terrific.
And that way, I think Agnipath is another aberration in that way, that if you look at Bollywood right from inception, if you're talking about a great iconic film, you are essentially also talking about the songs, right? Agnipath was one film where you are not, uh, talking, you're not even mentioning the songs. I mean, I don't think a lot of them are even worth mentioning. I mean, it was good music, of course, but I think it's not memorable. The songs are not memorable. There's the Alibaba and
Yes, there is
just the
that
set.
Shakti Kapoor item boy
Yeah,
appearance.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, it's a very strange thing, his appearance also. But it's not remembered for the songs. It's remembered for that iconic Bachchan performance. It's remembered for the dialogues. It's remembered for the writing. And what I think it also should be remembered for is an iconic gangster classic, which I think it is, and it should be given credit for. Um, yeah, yeah,
So you
that's
think
what it is. Yeah.
its legacy lies in one of the landmark kind of gangster movies?
One of the landmark gangster movies, I mean, if you talk about action is a very broad category to speak of, but I think in within the action genre, I think it's a very, very, very notable film.
Rightly said. Rightly said.
There's like I said, there's so much to add and there's so much to talk about. We can talk all night.
That's true. Yeah.
I'll just say, I'll just again reiterate what I just said about Mukul Anand and his films. I think he is way ahead of its time, and and one could look at the grand epic spectacle of Khuda Gawah, and even before that, if we talk about the before the trilogy, the films that he made, one of them was Sultanate, a very grand desert spectacle with kings and princes and huge budget. That film worked actually. I mean, it's Juhi Chawla's first film, and Karan Kapoor was there, the Bombay dying guy. So he had that.
Was that a hit at that time?
Yeah,
Okay.
Sultanate worked, but Agnipath definitely didn't. But Agnipath was uh, Mukul Anand's grand action spectacle. I mean, it had, like you were talking about Praveen Bhatt's cinematography. I think it's a collaboration, and how, right? How the kid, how they would have sat and designed the palette of the film, that the blood skies, which was so iconic of the 80s horror and action films, even in Hollywood. The sky would always be almost red, kind of a tint. So all of that was, I think, accentuated the character and the story a lot. I can imagine them sitting there and discussing the look of the village, how it starts. I think, apart from Parinda, before Agnipath, films were not that dark. Again, you can think of noir and the noirish films in the 50s, but after that, Bollywood is all about the bling, and there's color, and there's a lot of bright, garish clothes and colors, and everything is bright. There are no dark patches. But Agnipath was delightfully dark, even in the happy phase. You're showing the village, which is when he talks about electricity and light coming in, everything is lamps, right? In the initial phase, the village, if you look at even the kotha, where he goes to, the dancer and the whole thing, even that is lit by lamps. It's not very bright and well lit, and there's no chandeliers and stuff like that, which is the staple in films those days and the 80s. I think so that also was very, very iconic, and I think way, way ahead of its time. So I think it's
Technically,
all
the film
Mukul
is very
Anand.
strong. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
extremely strong. That also that scene where uh, the look of the whole thing, when Bachchan is riding that ship, you know, that speedboat, he's standing on it, and you can see that bomb dropping in slow motion, that grenade that Terry Lean flings at him. And and that scene, I mean, it always gives me goose flesh. I'm having goose flesh right now, even thinking of it, is that him in that complete suit, white suit, he's standing there on the ship, and that bomb drops, and he's seeing it drop, right, in slow motion. And the very next scene is Archana Puran Singh coming out of the sea. She's in that lounge, and he leaps out of the ocean and walks all in white again, right? So that's Mukul Anand for you. That's the Bachchan myth for you, and how they tried in their own little way to recreate that persona, that myth. There are a number of touches. I mean, there's Terry Lean, who calls the
What's up with
character
that
Terry.
name, Amborish?
I have no clue. So one way is maybe that, I mean, there's Hasmukh Bhai, who is kind of a jovial kind of a fellow, right? There is Usman, so go figure. But with Terry Lean, I think it was his clothes, right? So Terry Lean is a material. I mean, it's clothes, it's whatever, fashion. So he was shown again, one of those things that strangely Mukul Anand doesn't spell out. He doesn't spell out a lot of things. He spells out so many other things, but he doesn't spell out these tiny small nods that he does. There's this very stylish looking gentleman with suits and everything, and with a certain kind of mustache and with a stick, and you call him Terry Lee, right? And he's a villain, right? And you have a certain look of the 60s, but the same character in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, he has a different kind of clothing, and the mustache, the look is very different for the same character, right? Because the eras have passed, and he's wearing a different suit and different kind of clothes and all of that. But yeah, so those are the things that I think Mukul Anand did, and we should talk about them more, and these kind of discussions kind of should happen more. Uh, I think he was more than we gave him credit for. We talk about Gurudutt, we talk about again, not comparing with
Yes,
the
yes.
grades like
But I see what
all
you're
of that,
saying.
but
Yeah.
I'm saying Mukul Anand had his place as a filmmaker and as a visionary, whether during his life or after it. Mukul Anand's last year was Mukul Anand's 25th death anniversary. There was no talk about it. People didn't, speak about those unfinished films and the kind of films that he's left behind. So I think he deserves more conversations, more celebration, and all of that. And one way to do it is kind of revisiting his films and chatting about it like we're doing it right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. You said it. And, I think a lot of kids of today's generation will dig Mukul Anand's films because, like you said, they were high on technical finesse and style. And, one of the things that kids these days love is to dig out all the Easter eggs, the nods to classics and all that. And there's so many in Mukul Anand's films. And we can just keep on talking about this all night. But just real quickly, the scene that you were talking about where Bachchan walks out of the water is straight out of The Long Goodbye, where there is a similar scene with Elliot Gould. And of course, Archana Puran Singh's thing is like a born girl, right, from Dr. No. So that's definitely there. So, all these little things that Mukul Anand, probably those are the films that he loved. And I always thought that, if he was ever asked, a gun to your head, pick your favorite film, I think, he very good chance he would have said Agneepath. So, I don't know.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. I think, I mean, we can.
I mean, Hum is a
claim
huge blockbuster and all that. Khudagawa is huge.
yeah.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But probably, given what Mukul Anand stood for in terms of cinema and the aesthetic, I think he would have said
Yeah. To the extent that we have seen his films and seen his interviews and read him, to that extent, I think we can claim to know him. And
Right.
from that perspective, we can definitely say that if he's asked about his favorite from his crop of films, I think he'll definitely talk about Agnipath, also because it didn't work. Hum worked, Khudagawa, became a huge hit and stuff like that. But Agnipath was his baby, like how Raj Kapoor always kept talking about Mera Naam Joker, because that was one film of his that didn't do well. So I think it's the same for Mukul Anand in his entire body of work. That was one film which he very visibly made with a lot of love and a lot of film love, if nothing else, and it didn't work. It must have hurt bad. It must have really hurt. So I
Yes.
think he would surely call it his most fond or almost favorite work.
Favorite child. Yeah. Thank you so much, Amrish. This was great. I like I said, Agnipath is it's a film I like very much, and it was great chatting with you about that film. And you brought so much insight to this discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm glad you called.
Thank you, Amrish.
If you liked the episode, do consider supporting the show. Your support will help me continue creating content like this for fans of Indian cinema and Hindi cinema everywhere across the world. You can find the link for supporting the show in the episode notes and on the podcast website. Also, do share this episode on social media and do subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen to your pods. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at loveofcinemasf8. Feel free to reach out there or by email with your comments, feedback, and suggestions. You can find my email in the episode notes. That's the episode. This is Himanshu signing off. And as always, thank you for listening to the Love of Cinema podcast.